It's extraordinary, Paul, that you can go to a jam in New York City and have an experience where your difference is not emphasized for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that's because contact is amazing. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, what a dangerous thing to feel like we're producing spaces where difference is invisibilized or not recognized.
Exactly.
So I hold these two things in very interesting tension, and I'm not trying to resolve them. Mm-hmm. But I'm not interested in a community that doesn't want to see both of those things simultaneously.
Dropped In is a podcast about cultivating resilience through artistic practice. Hosts Paul Singh and Aaron Brando drop in with artists, activists, teachers, and improvising human beings to discuss the politics and poetics of somatic practice and purposeful embodiment in a world of ever-shifting obstacles. In a workshop entitled Post Contact, Keith Hennessy describes a dance laboratory for experiments in touch, sensing, struggle, collaboration, support, resistance, and relationship. We work with failure more than flow, with struggle more than ease. The goal is to extend the proposals and possibilities of contact improvisation. How do we engage, critique, and evolve the practices of CI? What are its limitations in relation to performance, contemporary art, choreographic innovation, and intervention? Keith Hennessy is an award-winning performer, choreographer, teacher, organizer, and artistic director of Circo Zero. Hennessy's work embodies a unique hybrid of performance art, music, visual and conceptual art, circus, and ritual. Keith has had a tremendous influence on contact improvisation, and he has shaped many of the ideas I personally bring into my practice. Join us for the first part of a two-part conversation with artist, provocateur, and seriously amazing human being, Keith Hennessy.
As you make some time for us today, make some time for yourself as well. Take notice of the temperature of the space you're in. Name it. And then take notice of the temperature of yourself. How they're different and still relate. And then take notice of your skin, the literal edge and meeting place of those two different temperatures. And after you take a moment to realize that attention you've created for yourself, transfer that attention to us and the conversation we're going to have today. It's funny, I've had this sentence in my head for the last few weeks. People keep asking me, oh, how are you finding some kind of physical practice right now as a contact person? And I was like, outside of sex, I feel like contact improv and what I do is probably the most dangerous thing, like act of art you could be doing nowadays outside of sexual relationships. Nothing I can think of asks that much devotion, consideration, proximity to another person.
Right.
And it's frustrating. So it was so great to see this piece. I saw pictures of the piece Olive and Keith online on Facebook, and I thought, finding a way to practice your work, or at least ask your questions in time of crisis. Lots of crisis. AIDS pandemic, economic crash, and now this. 3, just for example, right now. So what was that process like with Olive, and what brought it about, and what made you want to do it?
I mean, it started off really simply as a mom suddenly confronted with 2 kids at home and the schools being shut down, and her not being able to go to her place of work, which is a shared therapy space. So there was this instant crisis, and what happened is the mom put out to the building, because, I mean, one, just people are amazing, right? And our building has amazing people in it, just like I'm sure your neighbors are amazing, in meaning that everyone has something to teach. So the mom said, hey, I need help homeschooling. And I especially need it for the 1 hour from 12:30 to 1:30 when the 2-year-old naps, because the extroverted dancing 9-year-old and me and a therapy practice and a napping child cannot coexist in one apartment.
Right.
So, the local historian took one day, and the person who was prepared to teach sewing took a day, and somebody who is a Brazilian drummer took one day, and I took one day. And the first class was a talking class, like, yes, this is really homeschool. And the topic was drag and ball culture, because she had seen a small bit of Paris is Burning and wanted to understand it.
Mm.
So I said, you need to prepare 3 questions, because I don't, again, I come from student-centered learning ethics. So it was like, even a 9-year-old, it's like, it's not my class, it's your class. And she came with her 3 questions. And the first one was, do you have to be gay to compete or to do drag? And that opened this whole conversation about gender and folk queens and dancing and choreography and what performance is. And then when it was like, okay, Olive really enjoyed that, can you continue homeschooling once a week? I thought, really the best thing to do with a kid who wants to be dancing and me who wants to be dancing is to just make a work. And since a lot of my work, especially in the last few years, has really centered collaboration across lines of power and difference, I was like, well, how different could we get? 9 years old, 60, Black, white, female, male. My primary forms of dance are in experimental improvisation and performance art. Hers are in unison dancing, hip hop, and urban dance. And I was like, okay, we've got tons of lines of power and difference to think through. So I'm in my adult practice and I'm supporting a child to make dances, doing whatever she wants to do. And at the same time, how can I help inspire her to also experiment and stretch outside of her bounds? So every scene of the piece, and it had many scenes, I was thinking about a different choreographic practice. Like, let's have this scene be just improv where we're following each other's timing. And so it was very slow motion with breaks. And what we would follow was each other's breaks. And the slow motion, you did whatever you wanted. Or another section was just based on counting and walking, that you can make a dance from walking and numbers, which, of course, you wouldn't learn that in normal children's dance schools. So then, of course, there had to be an aerial section since it's working with me. So I hung straps off a palm tree and let Olive just experiment, and then we helped shape a choreography. So that's kind of how the process went. I treated it like one aspect is this service where I'm supporting my neighbor and I'm helping a child. And then the other was, how do I stay engaged in my practice, like the politics of dancing and collaboration that I'm in, and bring these 2 things together. And it actually was effortless in many ways.
Yeah, it's almost like a happy circumstance because, like you just alluded to, you couldn't find a partner that could be so more disparate in every possible way you've been working with. I think that's a real gift you have of putting any person you're working with on the same, just making them equitable with everyone that's listening or watching, or try to.
Yeah, I think it's less my gift and it's more my ethics, right? So, I mean, I fail at power abuse just like all kinds of people, but what I'm motivated by are certain kinds of ethics around collaboration and horizontality, so that me working with a 9-year-old, there is an adult and a child, but there's also a, whenever possible, also a horizontality. Like, I did not ever tell Olive what to do, for example, because I stopped doing that in my work 30 years ago. Like, I don't tell the dancers what to do. I create possibilities, and then people offer things, and then we negotiate, is that staying in the work or not? And I did that also with Olive. So there was a couple things where I felt strongly, and I used some of my, what I would call earned entitlement, like where I have experience in this field, and I used that sort of adultness to pressure her to agree with me. But I didn't ever say no or you can't. And I said a lot of yeses. And there's a lot of things in the work that you might go, well, how did that get in there? Or how did that get past Keith's, kind of aesthetic? And it's like, it's not my aesthetic. It's actually Olive and Keith, right? Like, and I named it that because I did a duet. It's almost 2 years ago with Gerald Cassell, who's an amazing choreographer, who's been doing a lot of thinking. He's an ex. Do you know him, Paul?
He is one of my mentors. I danced for him for 7 years.
Oh yeah. So Gerald's kind of amazing, and he has this legendary New York career before he moved to the West Coast. But since he's been on the West Coast, he's put a lot more attention into thinking about decolonizing Western dance practices and what it means to embody whiteness or colonial logics. And we made a duet that was just a very sweet practice, and we performed it on the beach in San Francisco, among other locations. But that piece was called Gerald plus Keith. And I thought, okay, the work with Olive is a very similar kind of approach, meaning two people meet and we just start to do things together, and then we see what can be made. And so I felt like that the Olive piece is very much in continuity with the Gerald piece. And in both cases, I instigate them, and I'm this person who has a tiny machine, but it is a machine, right? Like I have the nonprofit corporation and I have a little bit of funding and things like that. And I instigate projects and then say, okay, all the things that we identify around power and privilege are in place, but now what's possible? The conditions are asymmetrical and they might even be imperfect, but now what's possible and how can we meet each other?
I want to scale back just a second. We were so curious right before we got on with you about your how you met contact improvisation, like how you found it and how it washed over you then and how it's kind of carrying you now. But we're, as practitioners of it, we're so excited to hear about what your meeting of it was like.
Thanks. I was just drawn to dance very early. Like, if people are going to believe in anything like a spiritual calling or the notion of callings or the fates, I was definitely directed and pulled towards dancing from very early. And I grew up in a context where dancing did not really exist, especially for boys and men. So I was a competitive social dancer. And at the time that I was doing that, which started at the age of around 16, it was from 16 to 19. And we started with 50s dancing, so jitterbug, jive, the dance forms that I understood really as white rock and roll forms, but only later as an adult moved to the US and saw that Lindy Hop and Black social dance were actually, and what we now call swing, were actually the roots of the dances that I did as a teenager. And at some point, I saw a photograph of 3 men from Palobolis, naked, squatting among some rocks. So there was one guy squatting, and you could see maybe his heels, his ass, and his back. And then the next guy squatting on his shoulders. So ass, back, and then the third guy, ass, back, head. And I thought, that is the most beautiful picture I have ever seen in my life. Again, I am somehow, and I guess it's partly how I grew up and just how I've protected myself, I completely missed that I loved that photo because of how gay it was. I saw that as, this is whatever kind of dancing this is, that's the kind of dancing I'm going to do. I didn't think, oh, if I do this form of dancing, I will get to be naked with fit men with beautiful asses, like, which has been sort of like a lifelong, motivator, men with beautiful asses. But in that moment, I thought I was looking at an aesthetic project and a form of dance. And so I asked someone, what produced this beautiful image? And mistakenly, someone said, that's a form of dance called contact improvisation. And I was like, then that is what I will do. Whatever these people are doing, that's what I will do. So I learned when I was in Europe that the only real city in Canada from an international perspective was Montreal. So I immediately moved to Montreal to go to university, and I immediately picked my dance classes before I picked my academic work. So my academic work had to fit dance training. And I worked with some of the early contact experimenters in Montreal, a women's collective called Cat Poteau, Dina DeVita, who has become sort of a legendary Montreal dancer, and she started Tangente, which is the leading experimental postmodern dance space in Montreal and has been for 35 years. That led me also to working with Andrew Harwood and other people that you wouldn't recognize now. And I started doing contact in 1979 in Montreal because of a sexy photo of Pilobolus. Some years later, I actually took a workshop from Pilobolus and realized, oh, they're just control freaks like any other choreographers, and they have nothing to do with contact.
I'd love to hear about, like, well, the second part of the question is like, what about contact is still carrying you? But before you answer that one, I'm also curious, what are the like, where are the places where you have to reconcile a form that might still be held as entitled and privileged and not having a lot of access, and with your politics and the way that you are overtly political in the CI form, like, just how do you reconcile being in the world of contact improvisation, and like, what does it do for you now?
Good question. I still really enjoy a good contact dance. Mm-hmm. So that's real. Yeah. I don't do it very often, and I tend to do it more with people who are not in the scene. So like collaborators on projects that I'm with, if I can end up in some kind of physically intimate and weighted relationship in our dancing, I get a lot out of it.
Is that because you're just hungry for a kind of unknown that you can't get when you have a shared vocabulary?
There's two kinds of people in the world. There's the people who can have sex with someone whose politics they don't care about, and the people who can't do that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I have a good buddy, and it's like, it's insane to him to think that you couldn't suck someone's dick if they voted for George Bush or something like that. He's like, for him, the sexual space is another kind of space. And in fact, what's radical about it is how you can transcend certain kinds of race and class politics in a sexual space. Whereas I find it really hard to be intimate with people that I don't connect with in a more holistic way. And so I really resonated with that. So all that is to say that I don't resonate with a lot of the underlying ideological positions and the unstatedness of a lot of people in contact spaces. And when I do start speaking, I'm kind of disruptive. So I'm like a Debbie Downer for half the people, right?
And yet as a form, ideologically, there's a lot that you align with. I mean, are you aligned with the non-hierarchical view of the body, the democratization of the body parts, and there's some other contexts that like really pull you in. So there seems to be like some gap or something that you're constantly maybe holding a dialectic of sorts.
Yeah, and I would say that if there's a gap, I mean, I think there's a whole conversation we could have about democratization of body parts, because I'm a fan of the term and I like the vision of it. But I think that the citing it is one of the issues, the political issues that contact has never reconciled, which is that the external world to the contact space has a very particular hierarchy of body parts. And the tension between those two positions should be dealt with in a more explicit way in context spaces. And because it isn't, all kinds of harm is possible. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying. is the space between the dance and its potential and the communities that form around it. So, and this is where I've tried to write about and think through, is like the difference between the social space or the perceived sociality around the dancing and the dancing itself, and how those things impact each other.
I have several versions of this question going through my head, and one of them has to do with ritual. And how, I think the potential in ritual to enact or to manifest decolonization and to manifest anti-racism. And I'm hugely curious about that potential on a collective level. How, and I know you're a bit of an expert in this, Keith, so I want to put that to you, like how you create ritualistic performance that that brings about some of those forces or potentials.
I shy away from any of these, like, you're a master this, you're an expert at that, but these are places where I put a lot of my focus and attention and learning. What Brando said brought up two things, and I'm going to slightly step back, and then I'm going to try to segue that into this, how ritual can support efforts for decolonization and anti-racism. And I mean, just the reason that why I really appreciate that question, Leslie, and why I think it's important to talk about is because often we're, especially those of us who are growing up in middle class or settler contexts, regardless of how white we are, we can often think about anti-racism and decolonization as these kind of like logical, structural things that, like, now we do this, now we include like this, now we step back like this, like there's some kind of, it's an activist or even therapeutic practice or psychological thing. Like, oh, if you do these political steps, then these things will happen. And I think where I want us to come back to is the actual role of dancing, like this non-language activity, and then the place of the dancing in coalescing ritual spaces. So like ritual meaning we come together to, in one kind of time space, to shift our realities or our our material life in other spaces. Like a ritual is a poem in that way, right? It's activity in one kind of realm that is supposed to be an outside of norm space. Like we step outside of the quotidian to create some kind of resonance, electricity, vibration that will impact, that will change us, and that might even have transformational results in other times and spaces. Anyway, where I went with Brando was how racism functions in organizations, the difference between a multicultural organization and an anti-racist organization. And there's this one chart that actually has 6 categories. And one is like the one far side, you know, it's like a continuum from an actual white supremacist organization to like a revolutionary anti-racist organization or something like that. And there's a line that divides the first 3 groups from the second 3 groups. And right next to the line, but still on the white side, is the multicultural organization.
Wow.
Which is what many of us run. And the crossing of that line is to actually become an explicitly anti-racist organization. And what is the difference between those two things? And I think that a number of us who are involved in white-led organizations that have positioned ourselves as anti-racist are still very influenced by sort of liberal politics of diversity and multiculturalism. And we haven't actually taken a more radical step into destructuring the whiteness in our organizations and restructuring. And so that I'll just drop in as one way to think of it. The other is that in the early 80s, and this is an essay that people can look up, and there's an essay it's actually a talk that was given by Bernice Johnson Reagan at a women's music festival. And it wasn't the Michigan Women's Festival, but it was in the same movement of women's spaces that came out of the 70s. And she gave a talk at this festival where she tried to distinguish between home space and coalition space. And what she was describing fits very much. We could do a lot of learning by doing a comparison of how she saw feminist spaces at that time with how we're conceiving of contact spaces. And part of that is that there's a lot of contact dancers who come to a jam or to Earth Dance or to a festival and consider it a home space. And once it's a home space, which this is before the language of safe space, and she's basically describing safe space, that we think that in this space, there's a set of things that will happen and a set of things that won't happen. But it's a place of comfort, and it's a place to let down one's guard because we don't need to protect ourselves from these negative, like either patriarchal or male supremacist things in a feminist space. And so what's happened is that then women of color start to come into these feminist spaces, and the first women of color who come in are the women of color who are already able to function in predominantly white spaces, right? Which is how we might think of the small numbers of dedicated people of color in contact spaces. But it's very different and then what Bernice Johnson Reagan says is she's like, look, so you invite some women, but then those women invite me. And once I get here, it's no longer a home space because I'm actually here as a kind of disruptive element. And what she proposes is that the feminist space needs to be a coalition space, not a home space. You don't walk in expecting safety. She's like, home space feeds you. Coalition space, you need to feed it. Home space is a mother, it's a nipple, it's free-flowing milk. Coalition space, you need to produce that milk. You need to hold yourself. You need to like have fed enough before you got there to be able to sustain yourself in the coalition. But that coalition space is negotiated space. It's complicated space. It's possible to get hurt there. You need to figure out who your allies are and who they aren't. And so what would happen if the contact spaces were considered more coalition spaces? And I think that if I was to make a radical sort of jump from, Brando's questioning to Lindsay's, it would be to think about coalition space, not just as, again, a political process, but as an artistic and spiritual practice. Like, how do we figure out the gathering or the jam or even the meeting that becomes a ritualized space of coalition, and that is not just aligned with anti-racism, but becomes a new kind of decolonial processing? And I think that requires, all kinds of vulnerabilities and shifts in what we think of as leadership, but it also shifts how we try to imagine how time and space function, right? And I think that any white organizers who are interested in anti-racism, when they start working in decolonial spaces that are led by Indigenous people or that are led by Black people, for example, the importance of food in the space, the importance of, there's groups in the Southeast who have been heavily influential for me, who are working in Black and multiracial led anti-racist contexts, where it's like every meeting must begin with singing, every meeting must have food at it. The whole thing needs to, like, the time space of what is a gathering needs to shift from this 1 hour punctual agenda thing to, yes, the agenda matters, yes, facilitation matters, but we also need to be like, is this a heart-centered space? And are we not just saying you need to speak from the heart in the business meeting, but are we setting up the context where the hearts feel safe enough to speak? So I think there's all kinds of ways to bring ritual in. And then I would just go another whole step of like, what does it mean in my performance work? Or why do the temporary communities that I build around my performance work, whether it's a duet with Gerald or Olive, or it's these larger group works like Turbulence and Delinquent, there is a sense of trying to build a coalition space in all of those works where difference is acknowledged as the reason we're getting together, not as an impediment to the safety that we have, but actually as the motivating force. So it's a very different vibe to think of contact from, all the gifts of this, hippie influence that it has, right? Which is to think of contact as this water space of flow, where flow is prioritized. And then when we're looking for, larger cultural influences on the contact thing, we look to Asian martial art forms, Taoism, Tai Chi, Aikido, that are all based on circularity and flow, and where healing is seen as a non-impediment to energetic movement and circulation and flow and the spiral. And what does it mean if we start with, instead of assuming that is the starting position, if we assume that contact is actually a medicinal practice in the space where flow doesn't exist. So rather than some assumption about the universality of our two bodies being together, and again, I don't want to throw it out. I want to hold that space. I think that I've had my space of rejecting that entirely and feeling like the only fun dance is one that starts by punching each other or yelling at each other. And then if you can do that, then we can slowly roll on the floor, right? Which is why I kind of, hate the underscore, for example, because I see it as like an ideological practice of social control that assumes that it normalizes a narrative of starting on the floor, finding my kinesthetic space, then I find our collective. And it's like, no, we should bump into each other, recognize that there's injury, and then start to figure out what is the medicinal practice to, and again, I only say that because I work through provocation and disruption. So it's like, if I can create that friction sort of at the mind space, then I'm interested in what dance can flow from that. And I really think that there's some place where, even though I love talking and I could stay on this podcast for 44 hours and keep going. I do really treasure, and this goes back to, Brando's earlier question, I do really treasure a nonverbal physical space where bodies are listening and negotiating being together, and that the dance itself is improvised and experimental. We're not here to reproduce a certain vocabulary. We're here to reproduce, we're not here to reproduce anything. We're here to actually discover the potential of our beingness together. And those to me are have to be at the heart of any kind of ritualistic practices, right? Or, and I think there are things there are forms to ritual, it's like I studied in my own ways, Wicca predominantly, but then my spiritual name is Cousin, so it's like I spent a lot of time being related to, but not a direct family member of a lot of different pre-colonial, indigenous inspired spiritual practices. And so that impacts how I think about what it means to gather, what it means to consider ourselves together.
It's so interesting. There are so many things that you're saying that resonate with me as a person of color that practices contact improvisation. But there are so many things that you also say that terrify me for such oppositional reasons. As I read this description of how you describe post-contact, I'll scale back just for a second. When you described the dichotomy of people of color that go to the regular jam, and that don't go to the other, and vice versa, I definitely fall into one of those camps so clearly. And I joked with another person of color, maybe one of two of us at the Saturday jam in New York City out of 30 or 40 that come in the room. And we both made this observation one day that we don't even remember the color of our skin until we're leaving the jam and going to get food afterwards and walk by a glass front of a store and then go, oh crap, I'm not the same as these people. So when I read your description and I'm like, ah, crap, because it's, it's looking for struggle and resistance in relationship. And I'm usually trying to teach the opposite, or, it's not looking for flow, it's looking for struggle more than ease. And I'm just like, oh no, this is super, super challenging for me because I'm usually looking for the opposites. But the effect that you seem to be getting at is I understand I find it so admirable now, even though I don't fully understand how I could incorporate it into what I want to do. It's you've helped me understand the straddles that you sit on.
One thing I'd say to that is, my dissertation, I can't even remember the full title, but it centers around the two words ambivalent potential. So I think when I'm at my most critical, I'm mad at people who don't want to have this conversation with me, or who think it's disruptive to say white supremacy or to say rape in a contact space, right? Which I fully have experienced. And I do it partly to disturb those people who can't have the word rape said in a space. But at the same time, it's like, anyway, ambivalent potential, what I want to say about it is, it's extraordinary, Paul, that you can go to a jam in New York City and have an experience where your difference is not emphasized for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that's because contact is amazing. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, what a dangerous thing to feel like we're producing spaces where difference is invisibilized or not recognized.
Exactly.
So I hold these two things in very interesting tension, and I'm not trying to resolve them. But I'm not interested in a community that doesn't want to see both of those things simultaneously.